Welcome to George Mason University's Studio A. My name is Rick Davis, and today our guest is Richard Squires. Richard is a playwright and a composer and a worker on environmental issues, but today we're going to focus on his work as a scriptwriter, producer, and director for the feature film Crazy Like a Fox. Please welcome Richard Squires. Now, Richard, tell us a little bit about your background before you became a film director.
Well, in terms of the performing arts, I'd worked for some time in the theater, actually. Originally as an actor, actually originally as a stage carpenter. And then from stage carpentry, I went to acting, and then directing, and then playwriting. And at some point, I came to the conclusion that I really wanted to have the ability to write, to make works of art that were complete in a way that had all of the elements of the arts inside them. And that sort of led me towards film, because ultimately film can encapsulate all the arts.
But you had quite a long career in lots of other art forms before you settled on film.
I suppose you could say that.
Yeah.
I dabbled in the visual arts as well. I did performance environments and some sculptures and things like that.
So kind of putting it all together in the film medium.
It always felt to me like film was one of the areas where you could really unite all the art forms, yes.
And for your first big film project, you actually tackled quite a big piece, a feature-length film with major stars and lots of locations and everything. Tell us a little bit about the background of Crazy Like a Fox.
Well, as far as taking on more than you can handle, I think the best advice I can give on that is to not ask too many questions before you start actually working. We were able to raise a certain amount of money to do a film, and once we had the funding in place, it really was just a question of assembling and producing the movie itself. And I think that it turned out to be a good idea that we didn't ask ourselves too many questions about whether or not it was complete folly to jump right into a feature film production without having had any real experience in the film business before. I think that for many people, if you think too hard about issues like that, then you'll just find that you never do it.
Did you just take sort of one step at a time and keep adding the elements as you went along?
Well, I started with two things, really. I started with the locations from which we shot the film, and I started after that with a story that was more or less about those locations. My strategy was that I knew that it was going to be exceedingly difficult, and I wanted to see what kind of tactical advantages I could come up with that would give me sort of a heads up on the whole process. And I ended up thinking that locations were the key. That if I knew that I had control over the film's locations, and that I knew where we were going to be arriving every day to do our work, and if those locations would support a film story, that suddenly the whole project was grounded in a way that it wouldn't be if you were just going from one government agency or one private individual or one commercial entity to another and asking for permission to use their property for X amount of hours on X day of the month. Many films get tripped up on locations, as I later learned, and we had ours from the beginning.
Which is kind of nice since it's a film about place, really.
Exactly, and it was, I had lived in that area for 25 or 30 years. I knew it very well. I love that area of Virginia in the Piedmont. And I love some of the characters that live there who are really almost like 18th century Englishmen in their habits and their way of life. And whom aren't very well known outside this little English colony, this colony of English settlers who are now 7 or 8 or 9 generations old, living on the same farms that they built in the 18th century, many of them.
Let's meet some of those people and take a look at some of those beautiful locations. We have the trailer from the film, which I think will give us a nice introduction to both the visual style and some of the people that are in it.
That's great.
To begin with, the farm is not for sale. Corn's got rot, the horses are sick, the barn's condemned, the birds won't hatch, and the daggum swamp's polluted.
We've had some problems.
Nathaniel Banks is going a little crazy.
I was a bit crazy when I first came down here.
His wife thinks he's nuts.
There's a limit to how long I'm gonna hold this together.
His kids think he's loony.
Really a house, Dad?
Sure. Sort of.
Even his friends think he's off the wall.
What you doing up there, Nat? This house shall not be moved.
I know Thomas Jefferson built this barn and all that.
You see what I mean? No.
But he has good reasons.
How broke is he?
Right, he's real broke.
We just made $10 million.
Someone's trying to take away everything he loves.
If I leave it now, I'll never get it back. This is war.
Now he's mad as hell, and he's not going to take it anymore.
What are you doing here, Nat?
I need you to hold us together while I figure this out.
Crazy Like a Fox, a serious comedy about a man who has to fight
They got the law. It's up to you to get the justice.
for what is right.
I know my rights, damn it.
All you lawyers do.
Starring Royal Shakespeare Company veteran and Emmy Award nominee Roger Rees and 2-time Academy Award nominee Mary McDonnell. Crazy Like a Fox.
Can I try that, Dad?
Now, there's so much to say about that trailer, but let me pick up on the last little voiceover moment. The actors that you assembled for this show, some wonderful actors, both local from this region and some really major stars, Roger Rees and Mary McDonnell, who are stars of both stage and screen. Along the theme of biting off more than you might be expected to chew, how did you attract and work with actors of such a terrific quality?
Well, I get asked that question all the time, and
what do you usually answer?
well, my usual answer is that when we asked them, Roger said that he thought that it was an exceptionally good role, and in fact he wrote me a really heartwarming letter after the production was over, in which he said that it's only 2 or 3 times in an actor's career that they might expect to get a role like the role that he had in Crazy
beautiful.
Like a Fox, where he could really show everything that he had to offer as an actor. So Roger was impressed by the part. Mary said that she took it because she was impressed by the values inherent in the story. That she wanted to, that she thought that it would be really appealing to do a film that had some sense of, let's say, countervailing values to the normal decadence of the entertainment business.
Well, let me ask a quick follow-up on that. How do you, as a first-time filmmaker, how do you get scripts into the hands of people of that caliber?
With Roger, we had some casting directors in New York. We had long decided that we were looking for an English actor for the lead role, and we asked them to keep an eye out for English actors. And they found Roger for us. He's, of course, locally famous in Manhattan. With Mary, my producer and I had been stranded in Los Angeles on September 12th, 2001, because we had flown in on September 11th, 2001, to meet with Roger, and that was the day that the World Trade Center fell down. And all flights were grounded out of LA for the next 5 days. So that actually ended up being kind of a blessing in disguise for us, because we had 5 days in LA knowing for the first time who our lead actor was, in which we could sort of canvass the area
Yeah.
to see who might be interested in the
Wow,
part.
it's amazing.
And as I recall, my producer, Patricia Folkrod, spoke to Mary's manager and then spoke to Mary herself. And then she and I rode our bicycles over to Pacific Heights and left it on Mary's doorstep.
Oh, that's wonderful. What a great story.
Yeah.
Well, let's turn to our students in the audience here and see if you guys have any questions.
Hi, my name is Carlos, and my question to you is, what was your biggest challenge in filming Crazy Like a Fox?
I would say that for me, and I think for any first-time film director, overcoming fear is probably the biggest challenge that you'll have to face. Although, again, we were a little bit lucky in terms of being able to raise the money for the film. Often people I know answer raising the money is the biggest challenge. So I'm not sure which of those two to say in a generic way, but for me personally, it was overcoming the fear. It's, do you really want to have your rear end in a frying pan for 6 months while everybody is standing around watching you? That's kind of the question that you have to ask yourself. And if the answer is yes, then I would recommend becoming a film director.
That's great. Anybody else have a question for Richard?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Clint, and my question is, were there any scenes in Crazy Like a Fox that did not end up in the final film? And can you give us an example?
Yes, there were several scenes. Not only were there several scenes that didn't end up in the final film, but the beginning of the film, as it came out of the editing room, is entirely different from the beginning of the film as it was written and as it was photographed. There's a rule of thumb in the film industry that every aspiring director should really know, that you make a movie 3 times. The first time is in the script, the second time is in photography, and the third time is in the editing room. And this was one of the great advantages for us in terms of the way that this production was structured, and that we were able to really remake the film in the editing room, I think very much to its advantage. It'd be a little bit complicated to go into the details of that, but we changed the opening of the film completely to make it more dramatic and more dynamic in the beginning, in the opening scenes.
Another question. Yes.
Hi, my name is Meron. What sets you apart from other directors?
Well, I would say that directors, as do all people in the arts, fall into 2 broad categories. There are commercial artists and there are fine artists. I have always been more interested in the fine arts side of the equation. So I would begin by answering that question by saying that I see myself as more of a fine artist in filmmaking than as a commercial artist. That's not to disparage commercial filmmaking. I mean, I love The Bourne Ultimatum, for example. And I'm kind of crazy about Pulp Fiction. But I think that everybody, when they begin their career, has to make that kind of decision. And mine, for me, was just obvious to me that I wanted to go into what I would call the fine arts end of it, where you have as much control over the production as you can, where you're telling kind of your own story rather than somebody else's story, and where the basic intent behind the production is not necessarily commercial.
That's great. Can I ask you again a little bit more about the actors? Because again, I was struck in watching the film about the quality of the acting throughout the ensemble. And part of that has to obviously be the work of the director. And since you have a theater background, did you use any kind of theatrical technique or vocabulary with that group, or was it just talk about the way your process with the actors.
Well, we evolved a method of rehearsal that worked very well for us. I later found out that this is the method that Robert Altman always used as well. And I felt really happy when I found that out, because I had known, as I think most people do, that actors love to work with Robert Altman. What we would do was we would do a camera setup, a camera rehearsal in the beginning of a scene that would take 15 or 20 minutes. And then we'd bring the actors for the scene onto the set, and we would describe to them where we wanted the camera to be at certain moments in the scene and why. And then we would ask the actors to improvise the scene. And if they wanted to veer away from the camera setups that we had set up originally, we would then adjust the cameras for the actors. And then once the actors were sort of happy with that situation, we would just rehearse 3 or 4 times and then we'd shoot. We never had pre-rehearsals before we began production. In every scene, we rehearsed it for the first time the same day that we shot it, usually just an hour or so before we shot it. And I think that using that sort of vehicle where the actors have the priority over the camera, particularly in a script that has a lot of dialogue in it, is a godsend for the actors themselves. They really obviously prefer that because they want to be able to put themselves into the role.
When you say you improvised the rehearsal, were they improvising dialogue as well, or just the blocking and staging of the scene?
Well, every once in a while, an actor would ask me if he could change a line of dialogue, and which I must say would really reveal to me over and over what a great advantage it is to be both screenwriter and director, because you can instantly answer the questions. Often when an actor would want to change a line, a director might feel that he had to go back to the screenwriter because he may not actually understand how that would potentially change the meaning of the story, right? If you've written the story yourself, then the answer to all those questions are just at the tip of your tongue, because nobody knows the story better than you do.
Yeah. Was there ever a time where you felt like you might have gotten in your own way as being both the writer and the director, or was it always a symbiosis?
It was always a complete symbiosis. I never had any issue like that whatsoever. In fact, to me, it was a great empowering feature, because most film directors spend all of their day answering other people's questions about what the meaning of the story is. That's what they're supposed to know. And my feeling was that if you've written the story and you're willing to stand up there and answer the questions, then there's really almost nothing to directing if you have a good DP.
Which leads me to my next question. The visual style of this film is really so lush and so beautiful, the lighting, the camera work. Talk about your relationship with your director of photography and how that evolved and how you helped set the style of the film.
Well, Gary Grieg is a local Washingtonian. He's been working in documentary films and advertising for the last 35 or 40 years. He's widely thought to be the preeminent photographer in the area, and he's unbelievably fun to work with, which meant that when Gary was the one that was assigned to the job, we immediately got the best possible crew from the Washington, Baltimore, Richmond area, because everybody wants to work with Gary if they can. This was Gary's first feature film. And
wow.
many people told me that I was crazy to hire as a first-time director of photography. And I think in 99 cases out of 100, they probably would have been correct. It's not something I would generally recommend. But I spent a lot of time with Gary before making the decision. He really wanted to do it. And if there was one single brilliant decision that the producers and I made in the film, it was taking a chance on Gary. there really was no chance. I mean, he was ready to do this, and he had the best crew in the area. So the only chance was really just the mere incidental fact that he had never actually made a feature film before.
How specific was your shooting script, for example, in terms of shot description and selection? Or was that some of that evolved on set, or was that pretty specific?
Well, another thing that I liked about working with Gary, and again, working with somebody who was local, was that he was willing to commit 6 to 8 weeks before production began to go over the locations and to absorb the atmosphere of every scene in the movie. And during that period of investigating really mostly the 2 major locations of the film, which were 2 different farms near Middleburg, the whole idea of how to shoot the film evolved completely. Gary was constantly moving scenes out of the houses and out of the dining rooms and the bedrooms and the kitchens and into the barns and the fields and the creek. You know, Gary just wanted to open it up visually.
The beautiful outdoor dinner scene.
The beautiful outdoor scene was actually the only fight that Gary and I ever had, because I had written that to be in the dining room, and Gary, the dining room had 8-foot ceilings. It was about 20 feet long and about 15 feet wide. And Gary, in his wisdom, knew that it would be a complete disaster to shoot it there, but he had to fight me for the privilege.
Yeah, that's great. Let's turn back to our studio audience, if we may. Who else has a question? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I was wondering what advice you would give to film students.
Well, that's a tough one for me because I've never been a film student. I was never really a theater student either. I think from my own point of view, my best advice would be to remember that, that filmmaking is a practical exercise. It's something that people do. And I would be careful if I were in film school that that film not become something that you study and talk about and theorize about, but rather remain something that you do. Because if you don't do it, then it doesn't happen. And that, I think that sometimes that can be an issue for students, insofar as I understand the issues that students face in film schools.
Great. Anybody else have a question? Yeah. You want to pass the mic down?
Hi, my name is Christian, and I wanted to ask you, idealistically, what do you want people to say about your work 20 years from now?
I would say if you think that Western culture is a library, I think it would be really nice if people said, well, yeah, he's got a couple of books in the library. That's how I would answer that question.
It's a lovely thought. Who else has a question? Anybody over here? Yeah.
Hi, how are you? My name is Sophia. I understand now where you hired your lead actors for the film, but did you hire any talent from Virginia?
Yes, we did. All of the parts except for the 2 lead roles and the 2 main supporting roles were hired locally. And that would mean, for example, the broker is from Richmond, the judge is from Richmond, a number of actors from Washington, all of the extras are from Virginia. The mechanic is from Rappahannock County. The 2 kids are from Loudoun County. So yes, they were all locally cast except for the 4 leads.
Anybody else have a question in the studio audience? Yes.
Did you use a casting agency?
Yes, we did. Dagmar Whitmer did all of the local casting for us. And she actually contributed her services afterwards because she lives out in the country herself, and she so much appreciated the sort of theory behind the film that it was an anti-urbanization film. or anti-suburbanization film, I guess would be more accurate.
Anti-sprawl.
Anti-sprawl, yes. Anti-all that.
I had an auntie named Anti-Sprawl once. Yeah. Can I ask you another kind of question? And it has to do with the sound of the film and specifically the musical score of the film. Now, I know you're a composer.
Mm-hmm.
Did you write the music? Did you work with a composer on the music, or how did that evolve?
I had always intended to write the music myself. Writing music to me, especially for a work of art that's already finished, is close to pure pleasure because all the work's done for you in the film itself, and you just have to make it sound right. I hope that's not too confusing, but you're not working from a blank page. Mm-hmm. You've already got the film in front of you, and you just have to evoke how that would sort of translate into oral sounds. But at the time that when it came time to write the music, I had also become the de facto producer, because by that time we were well into post-production, and the production producers were long since off to whatever careers they had after Crazy Like a Fox. And so I found that I was way too nailed in to be able to do the music on my own. And I found a local composer named David Kane, whom I ended up having a really good working relationship with. And basically, I went over with David the general outlines of the kind of orchestra that I wanted. I had a very specific idea about the orchestra, and that it would be weighted away from strings and towards woodwinds, and away from brass as well, and away from percussion. I really wanted a kind of like a medieval or Renaissance woodwind
Mm-hmm.
kind of sound, so that it would sound like a little bit of a village square thing, since it was a small movie.
Yeah.
And I wanted to use old Virginia songs, like East Virginia, which is the recurring theme of the whole movie, actually, and another beautiful hymn by William Byrd, who's a Renaissance English composer.
Yeah. This strikes me as the kind of advice that only a composer could really give to another
Exactly.
composer.
It was
It's
very
really
good
beautiful.
composer to composer.
Yeah.
It was a great collaboration that way. And I told him that I wanted to have kind of a Prokofiev sound. And we actually listened to things like Lieutenant Kiji and things like that before we began working on it. And I gave David the basic melodic lines of the thing, and then he really took it from there. Well, and I must say, he did a much better job from there than I ever could have done, because he's a much more experienced composer than I am.
Well, Richard, we're out of time, but it's a beautiful film, and I recommend it to everyone, Crazy Like a Fox. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Our guest has been Richard Squires, and I'm Rick Davis for Studio A.